going. Wasn't that screen? Try that one. Okay, so that's screen 2. I want screen 1. Is there? No, screen 2 is the one I want. Good. Share, and then this should work.
All right. Yep.
We're good to
you're
go.
Good, Rick.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Alyssa, and thanks to Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority for asking me to come and give this talk. Those that know me know that my passion runs pretty deep for native plant gardening. And in fact, I've been accused of not knowing when to shut up when it comes to native plants. But the truth is, I'm not always talking about native plants. Sometimes I'm actually asleep. But even then, quite often I find I'm dreaming about my gardens when I am asleep anyway. Unless otherwise indicated along with the pictures, I'll just let you know that all the photos in here, for the most part, I've taken myself, and the bulk of them are actually from pictures from my garden. So where do I garden? Well, I'm here. I'm in southwestern Ontario, not far from Chatham, in the town of Ridgetown. And the nice thing about where I live is that I am in what's called the Carolinian zone. And this is probably I believe it's the most species rich of any biological region in Canada, from what I've read. And we have in Ridgetown here, deep loam, sandy soils, and which makes gardening just a real pleasure. So I grow a lot of different things here, but as you'll see, they're pretty much all natives. So what are we going to cover? Well, throughout the talk, I'm going to talk about why we grow native plants. I'm going to give you a little bit about my gardening background and how I got to this point. I'll give a quick history of the evolution of my gardens from being a bare lawn when I bought my property right through to what they are now. I've got a few slides here of wildlife in my garden, and that is mostly insects, but a few birds and reptiles and amphibians as well. We'll cover some definitions of things like what is a native plant and what is a wildflower and so on. I want to talk for a bit about what native plants that we should grow in our gardens, and just to give you some ideas of what you can do for the bugs, for yourself, and for the birds, for your kitchen, and so on. Then I've got a section towards the end of the talk that is just a list of resources. And since this is being recorded for posterity, you'll be able to go back and check those resources out. And then if we have time at the end, I've got about a 4-minute tour of just photos of flowers in my garden. All right. So why grow native plants? Well, we hear a lot on the news about loss of species, and this is due to things such as habitat loss. We farm most of the land now, and what isn't farmed is increasingly covered by asphalt and concrete as we need places to live. So we take away their habitat. Climate change is exacerbating some of this habitat loss as well. As things warm and insects can't change as fast as what our climate is changing, they can't adapt. So we're losing insects, which in turn, we lose the species that feed on those insects. We have competition from invasive and other non-native species that we've brought into our gardens over the last couple of centuries that have gone into the wild and taken over the habitat from the native plants. And wildlife has evolved with these native plants and needs them to survive. So if we want to provide food for all the wildlife, then we need to start growing native plants in our garden again to give them something to live on. But first, who am I? Well, as Alyssa said from her introduction, I've been gardening since I was a kid. I probably had my first vegetable garden when I was about 10 years old, and helped in the gardens all my life. As a teenager, I gardened a lot. In the early years, if it wasn't edible, I wasn't interested in growing it. I thought, why grow something just to look at? You got to have something that you can eat. And so until I was probably in my late 20s, early 30s, that's all I grew. And then I discovered some herbs and added that to my garden. I started to get into unusual plants like yellow beets and white beets and purple beans and things that are fairly common now in vegetable gardens, but way back then they were just being introduced, and I got excited with how cool these different things were. And so into my 30s and so on, I started growing more exotic plants. I got into flowers. And the more unusual it was, the better as far as I was concerned. I just loved finding interesting things that nobody else had. But then around 2005, I bought a packet of wildflower seeds, and that opened my eyes to what native plants could do. In researching what I had in this packet, I discovered a lot of things about native plants and about the importance of native plants. And so now I grow only natives or near natives. I will, if it's growing close to this region and I think it has value, then I'll add it to my garden. But I would say that at least 80 to 90% of the plants I grow are actually native to where I live. So I've been growing these since 2006 is when I started. In the fall of 2019, I took the last of the non-natives out of my backyard. And that last one to go was a beautiful big saucer magnolia tree that everybody thought I was crazy to remove. But in fact, I've replaced it with a wild black cherry tree that has berries for the birds in the spring. It has beautiful white flowers. And I am so happy that I have it growing where I do. It's also a host plant for a number of butterfly species. Currently, I've got over 300 native species. The last count on the spreadsheet, I think, was 320. That includes ferns, grasses, sedges, flowers, shrubs, and trees. And all of those, except some sugar maples, I have planted. They were the only trees in my yard that were native, other than a silver maple that's since died, but everything else in here I have planted. So here we have a picture of my yard when I bought the place in 2004. You can see it was a half an acre of grass. There was a dead plum tree here and another dead tree here that I never figured out what it was. This is the saucer magnolia in 2004. It was a nice little tree. And over here, there's a beauty bush. And you can see this little bush here was a forsythia. And that was the only vegetation in the backyard, really, other than a silver maple off in this corner. What you're looking at here is a map the road is right there. I'm lucky my house is a tiny little wartime bungalow that sits right on the front corner of the property, right on the property line. And this is looking from the back towards the front. Here we're looking from beside the house towards the back. There's that forsythia bush. There's the silver maple that died. And as you can see, I'm starting to clean out already in my first year some of the species that were growing there. Fast forward from 2005, another 8 years, and this is what my yard looked like. So in 2012, I had put in this escarpment through here with a waterfall down here. I had already started removing many of the natives, but you can see the saucer magnolia had become very large, as had the beauty bush in 2013. There you can see the forsythia over on that side of the field, the fence, the property. This was the first garden that I planted wildflowers in. And in that packet of wildflower seed mix, turned out there was only actually one native species. The rest were all not native. But I had not knowing much about natives at the time, and I wanted a garden, so I planted a few other things. And what you see here is a little patch of ditch lilies that still remain. They were the last of the non-natives in that particular flower bed. And I have a fern garden at the back. So I kept planting things. This is a Kentucky coffee tree that I put in here, and it's done very well. Move ahead again another few years, and this is what the garden looks like from the back corner looking up towards the waterfalls. So that last shot was taken from over on that corner looking up this way. And you can see a new garden I put in this past summer. Back in here, you can just barely make out a garden that I put in the year before. This is my very large hackberry tree. And for those who've been to my garden, right here on the right-hand side of this image is the Garden of Giants, where I have a whole pile of very tall plants like cup plant and so on. And then this fall, the last shot of the season, and this is what it looks like standing at the waterfalls, looking back towards that back corner where the previous image was taken. As you can see, I don't have a lot of spots left that have full sun. Most of it is grown up in trees. That's the Kentucky coffee tree. As you can see, it's become quite large. This is a tulip tree that was planted in 2006. It's about 50 or 60 feet tall now. There's a little patch down here in front of my garden shed that gets mostly full sun. And then just off to the left here, there's another full sun patch, or mostly full sun anyway. And so that's my garden. That's what I get to wander through and play in all summer long. So why do I plant native trees? Well, if you match up the plant species with the conditions you have in your yard, then they're low maintenance. What I find is that they're practically no maintenance at all, other than thinning out a few that have self-seeded where you don't want them to. And I do spend a lot of time doing that because my gardens are well established now, and there's always things popping up where I think it shouldn't be. I could just let it go, but I still have to have some control on my garden, right? I also try to do my bit to reverse species losses. So if I can find some rare plants that I can find a good home for, then I will plant those as well. And of course, I plant it for the beauty. When I started, it was mostly for what appealed to me aesthetically. I love to find beautiful wildflowers that were native and plant them. But more and more, as the more I understand and discover, I now plant and make my plant choices for the bugs and the birds. It is just so rewarding to go out there on a sunny afternoon and see my flower beds just abuzz with all kinds of wasps and bees and butterflies and moths and you name it. It's a great experience. And so I'm going to give us a little quick tour of some of the wildlife that I've found in my garden over the years. This is just a tip of the iceberg of what you'll see in my garden. The great golden digger wasp, I usually find it on the butterfly weed. It seems to have a preference for it, and the bright orange on him pretty much matches the butterfly weed flowers. Tree frogs. I couldn't believe it when I saw this guy sitting on top of the leaf of an American hazelnut. I don't know where they came from. There's no water nearby my place other than my own little pond, which is artificial, but I had 3 green tree frogs on my property one summer, and they actually wintered over as well. This guy, the great black digger wasp, is another amazing one to watch in the garden. Very gentle wasp. You can get right up close and observe them. And what I find most excited about this guy is that when he's on dotted horse mint, he's just in his glory. And I have a small patch of dotted horse mint, maybe 3 or 4 feet across, and there will be a dozen of these wasps just constantly flying around and getting pollen and nectar and whatever else they're gathering from it. And what is really cool is they are a principal pollinator for that plant. What everybody loves, the monarch butterflies. I have several milkweed patches throughout my property, and I have monarchs all the time in my yard. Does anybody know what this is? I don't see the screen that shows when somebody answers the chat. So I'll just go ahead anyway and talk about it. This is actually a ladybug larva. And you can see here, we have some aphids on this leaf. And there he is eating an aphid. And down here, these little white dots, there's the chat, it's up there. The little white dots here are the ones that he's already sucked all the good stuff out of, and that's just their exoskeleton left on there. So when I see I've got access to the chat now, so if anybody wants to answer a question when I throw it out there, just to show off how much you actually know, go for it. I'd love to see that. Here is a blue dasher dragonfly perched on a dried plant stalk. And this is another really important reason we keep hearing people say, leave the plant stalks in the fall. Leave them all summer if you can tolerate it, because dragonflies always want something to perch on. And they like just a bare twig or an old plant stalk where they can sit and watch for their prey, and then they take off, capture it, fly back to the same stalk, and they sit there. And you'll have dragonflies in your garden if you give them a place to perch while they're feeding. Here we have a giant swallowtail on the blue flag iris around my pond. And the blue flag iris are always busy with bees as well when they're out. When I planted 3 plants of this originally when I built the pond, and a few years later, those 3 clumps had grown, so that last year I had 150 blossoms on those between the 3 plants. And they don't stay open any more than a couple of days, but that period lasted almost 3 weeks as a few opened every day, and it was just a beautiful sea of purple. Here we have the 4-toothed mason wasp on bee balm. And I added this picture because I was very excited to find that this is actually classified as imperiled in Canada. And yet I have them in my yard. I also have tons of fireflies, and the yards around me, which don't have anything other than lawn, have virtually none other than a few that wander out of my yard. And in the summer months, it's just like sitting in the middle of a pile of shooting stars in my backyard as the fireflies fly about. This was an experiment on my part. I took a green-headed coneflower and I put it into a pot and I moved it up onto my deck, and it grew there all summer long and got quite tall, probably 7 feet high at least, in a pot. And then when it went to seed in the fall, the American goldfinches moved in and they started to feed on all the seeds. And it was really cool to watch because my patio table was less than 10 feet away from this plant. And they didn't care that I was there watching them. They just come in by the flocks and feed away. So you can do that in your garden as well. And if you grow red flowers, that's the cardinal flower here, but the hummingbirds are attracted to bee balm as well, and even to wild columbine. The red is their favorite flower. And I usually have a nectar feeder out for the hummingbirds anyway, but they don't visit it all that often anymore now that I've got all these other flowers in my yard. And I would argue that a water feature is one of the greatest things you can add to your garden. This water feature attracts all kinds of wildlife. Everything feeds on it. It runs year round. So the birds are out there in the wintertime. Sometimes I have to break a hole in the ice, but they'll be out there getting a drink. I've had toads living down in the stream area. I had 5 green frogs move in one spring and spend the entire summer in my pond, and yet it's only about a foot deep and 3 feet across. So it doesn't take a lot of water to keep them happy. Here's another robin getting a drink from the pond. And a cool thing about it is that the birds seem to have a preference to where they go for a drink or for a bath. And robins like it up here near the top of the waterfalls. This is the pond right here to its left. But cedar waxwings will come in and at the base of the falls where there's lots of splash, and that's where they will take a bath. And I've had flocks of them just constantly going back and forth to bathe in the waterfall. Now, I also have some of these guys. They're not as welcome as some of the other wildlife in my garden. It's a constant battle between the squirrels and me to see who is more intelligent. I'm not sure I'm winning. I use up a lot of chicken wire to hide things from them. Anything that has a tuber or a bulb or is valuable or is rare, I make sure that I have chicken wire covering it. Because these guys will dig it up for a snack, and they will dig it up whether they eat it or not. They'll dig it up just because they can, I'm sure of it. And the other wildlife that's not as welcome as some is this one. I've named this one Chelsea because she likes to give my plants the Chelsea chop. For those that don't know what a Chelsea chop is, it's when you prune your plants back to about half their height in the early season so that they'll grow in a little thicker, bushier, more flowers, not quite as tall. Works beautifully for things like asters, for goldenrods, and quite a few others. But it does not work well at all with things like wild blue phlox or bottlebrush grass and a few others that Chelsea seems to have taken a liking for. In fact, those plants took 2 years to come back after she mowed them off to the ground. So we'll cover a few definitions here. Wildflower, difference between that and something that's naturalized, invasive, native, and so on. And a lot of you probably already familiar with these terms, but just so we're all on the same page, I thought I'd give some quick definitions. So a wildflower is simply something that's growing freely without human intervention. It's any uncultivated flowering plant, which means that it can be a native or it may not be native. Here we've got some trilliums and what appears to be some phlox in the background, some native species. But a wildflower also includes something like chicory, which is a garden escape. It was brought over for garden use, both for its blue flower, but also for its coffee substitute roots, I believe. And then we have other wildflowers that were brought over and escaped from gardens, like purple loosestrife, which turned out to be very invasive once it got out into the wilderness areas. And we've done this with a number of plants as well. So all of those are wildflowers. A naturalized plant is one that is not native, that Europeans first brought over, and other nationalities when they brought them from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, and they've actually taken over out in the fields. They live alongside our own plants. Many of them, like yellow goat's beard, are not that harmful because they don't grow in thick enough clumps of it. But the main difference between the naturalized and a wildflower is that a naturalized, by definition, is not native. And as a result, it may or may not be invasive. So what is an invasive species? Well, the Canadian Council on Invasive Species identifies it as an introduced species that negatively impacts the environment, economy, and or society. So who knows what this one is? This nasty native, or non-native rather, invasive species. Let's see in the chat. Phragmites, you got it. Yeah, we know our invasives. Here's another image for you to look at. Canada goldenrod, is that an invasive species? What do you think? I often hear I don't want to grow it because it's invasive. But is it? Right. It is native. So by definition, an invasive species is a non-native. So what is a native plant? Well, one good definition is it's a plant that's evolved in a region or has existed in the region long enough to have evolved strong ecological relationships. I like the definition pre-European. That's one of the most commonly accepted qualifications for what is native. So before Europeans, the settlers came and brought plants from other continents. Anything that was growing here before that could be considered a native species. But the National Wildlife Federation says it's a plant that has occurred naturally without human introduction. The First Nations moved plants around all the time. They brought things like pawpaw for food. They brought white sage for medicine and things like that. So are these plants native because humans brought them in? I would argue that if we go with the very simplistic definition of pre-European, that makes them native. So that's one of the reasons I like the pre-European definition, because it keeps it cut and dried. It gives us a boundary of when the plant is native. But native to where? To Canada? A lot of these plants are, but for those of us viewing this talk from south of the border, just extrapolate what I'm going to say next to your particular region. But in Canada, it's a huge country. So what grows down here where I am is probably not going to grow up here in the Yukon. Our geography, our climate is just way too variable for everything to grow everywhere. And so we have to narrow things down. And so what we can do is we can say it's native to Ontario. Good, I can grow it. It's native in Ontario. And I see a lot of people, this map comes from the database of vascular plants of Canada, or VASCAN. And it shows the nativity, I guess you will call it, of plants based on a map. But all this map really tells us is that it's native somewhere in Ontario. And so when people say in Thunder Bay, say, well, orange coneflower is native to Ontario because the map says so. Yes, it is, but it's only native right down here in the very southernmost tip. And so we have to narrow things down even further. And so we could do that. We could say, let's just look at Southern Ontario. Surely that's consistent enough that we can grow native plants anywhere in Southern Ontario and it'll be native. Well, actually, what you see in this map of geology of Southern Ontario, all of this over here in red is the Canadian Shield, which is acidic, it's granite based, and the rest of the province overlays, the soil lays on top of limestone and is limestone based. So very different chemistries in the soil. We also have different weather patterns and so on across Southern Ontario. So even that is not close enough. One of my prized plants in my garden is my Canada lily. And lo and behold, when I did my homework on it, I found out, yes, it's native to Ontario, but only over here near Ottawa region. And it was never found native in southwestern Ontario. But it's close enough for me for now, it stays. So many here will recognize this, especially if you're from Southern Ontario. This is the Carolinian zone, so called because it has a lot of the same climate characteristics and geophysical characteristics is much further south of us in the Carolinas. We grow a lot of species here that are found down there, tulip trees, pawpaws, redbud trees, and many, many perennials that aren't found north of that line just because the climate and geography suits it. So we should be able to grow something in Niagara if it grows over here in Chatham, Kent, shouldn't we? Because it'll be native in both places. Well, actually, if you look at some of the native range maps, this is purple milkweed. And so you can see the shaded area is where purple milkweed is considered native, where it was found pre-European. And so it was found down where I live, but it was never found even over here in Niagara. They're both in the Carolinian zone, but for whatever reasons, and Mother Nature obviously has her reasons, purple milkweed grew over here, but not here. By the same token, we have black cohosh, which grew over here in the Niagara region and even south of us, but was never found where I live here in the southwestern tip of the province. And so, in my opinion, that a plant is only truly native if it is native to where you live. So if you want to be a purist, then that's something to keep in mind. In other words, a plant should not be considered native to where you live if it never grew there naturally, even if it could have. I hear lots of people say, plants don't understand political boundaries. If it's growing in Detroit, then it should grow in Chatham. Well, yeah, it could have, but it didn't. There's no records of a particular plant ever having been here for whatever reason. So it's not native here. And this is a discussion I've had many times with people. And whether I've convinced them or not, I don't know, but I'll leave it up to you to decide. But does that mean I shouldn't grow that plant? Of course not. And there's very good reasons to grow plants that aren't necessarily native to exactly where you live. Everybody here, I'll bet, has either heard of, if you haven't read, Doug Tallamy and his research that showed that it takes 5,000 to 6,000 caterpillars to raise one nest of Carolina chickadee babies. And what was even more surprising to me was that the adults needed at least 70% native plants within their nesting territory to successfully fledge that nest of babies. And if you had any less than 30% natives, then the nest wouldn't fledge. And that was, to me, quite an eye-opener. So yes, as long as you've got at least 70% natives, then the Carolina chickadees are going to be fine. If you get less than 30%, then probably not. Now, we don't have Carolina chickadees here in Southern Ontario that I'm aware of, but I'm going to assume that many other bird species that use caterpillars to feed their babies, which is something like 97% of the species, the stats will hold true for them as well. So if you have lots of native plants, you'll have lots of insects to feed the birds. And that's really why I do this, is to provide food for the insects so I can enjoy them. And then I can enjoy the birds that are also enjoying them in a different way. So which plants do I plant? Well, that depends. Do you have shade or full sun? Is it dry in your yard, or is it damp? If you remember at the beginning, I said match the plants to your conditions. Do you want to grow plants for the pollinators? Do you want to have seed plants for the birds? We have lots of plants that the goldfinches and other finches love to hang around in my garden because there's lots of seeds in the fall for them. Or do you want to specialize in butterflies and grow host plants for caterpillars? There's lots of caterpillars out there, moths and butterflies both, that are very fussy about what they eat, and just growing any old thing will not work for them. We've got tons of plants with beautiful colors to choose from. I don't know why we need to go to exotics in our garden for color, because take a look at some of this. We've got Ohio spiderwort here, wood lilies. We've got a serviceberry flower. This is blue lobelia and wild columbine. I mean, that's as beautiful as any of the exotics you see in the nursery shelves, in my opinion. And this little shot down here is just one of my gardens. If we want to grow plants for nectar to feed the bees, butterflies and moss, lots of choices. Here we've got, cylindrical blazing star. Actually, that looks more like an ironweed, but I wrote down cylindrical blazing star. And I probably wrote it down because the monarch butterfly is attracted to my cylindrical blazing star like a magnet. It is always covered in them. Eastern tiger swallowtail here on cup plants, and there must be something about the yellow that attracts them because that's one of their favorite places to go. And here we have a pearl crescent on a black-eyed Susan. If we want to grow plants for pollen, there's lots that the bees will just get buried right into the plants. Here we've got anise hyssop. Here we've got a purple coneflower. And unfortunately, I don't remember what that one was. But here we've got a cup plant. And another one that is always active with bees collecting pollen is my yellow giant hyssop. Despite the fact that there's only a few little blossoms open at any given time, it is a constant activity of bees. It's also a host plant for the summer azure butterfly. If you want to feed the birds, well, there's lots of choices. Dogwoods, chokecherries, currants, all these berries they love. Robins love juniper bushes. And pokeweed is a favorite of many birds. In fact, I've got a large pokeweed plant that I let come back every year. And I've seen flocks of robins go in and spend 20 minutes just eating the berries, fly off, and 10 minutes later, a flock of starlings would come in and do the same. And when they left, there were still berries left, but they love them. This is actually one of the first bits of fruit on my wild black cherry tree that I planted. And the nanny berry down here, these berries aren't ripe. They will get dark blue. Unfortunately, they rarely get dark blue in my garden because the birds come in and in one day they'll clean off the entire crop within an hour or so when they're getting almost ripe. And of course, there's wild strawberries, which the birds love, so do the squirrels, which means that I never get to have any of them. Now, you can feed yourself with native plants as well. Jerusalem artichokes, if you've never tried them, they're a member of the sunflower family. The tubers, there are commercial varieties available that have larger tubers and different colors in the tubers, but even the native ones are delicious, and they are very prolific. As I said, a member of the sunflower family. You won't buy seeds from them likely because the seeds are seldom viable, but that doesn't matter because all you need to do is drop a piece of one of these in your garden and it'll grow. And in fact, it is so aggressive that people recommend you don't grow it in a small garden, but I found a workaround. What I did was I cut a couple of plastic or a plastic barrel in half, 45-gallon drum, drilled some holes in it, buried it into the soil, and planted my Jerusalem artichokes in it. And this is just me sticking the shovel in, taking the first scoop of crop out of it in the fall. You can see it's just thick down in there with tubers. And I'll clean the entire crop out of that barrel and then just leave it go till the next year because the little pieces that I missed will grow into new plants and you'll have another crop in the following year. It's a great way to keep aggressive spreading plants in check. You can also feed yourself with nuts and berries that are all native. Wild black raspberries, fabulous to eat just raw, but also make beautiful jam. These are hazelnuts. They taste like the store-bought hazelnuts. They're much tinier, but just like the wild blueberries compared to the commercial ones, they have all the flavor packed into that tiny little body. And so you get a very intense hazelnut flavor from them. Unfortunately, they are also a favor of the squirrels, so I've never harvested any of those off of my bushes either, and yet they're loaded every year, and I've had them for quite a few years now. There's pawpaws, and I won't go into why I don't grow pawpaws anymore. If you follow me on Facebook at all, you've probably heard my rants about them. Beautiful plant, but just a little too aggressive for me. Black walnuts taste better than the store-bought walnuts. A lot harder to get into, to crack them open, but once you do, it's well worth it. 5,000 squirrels in my town can't be wrong. Canada plums, really sweet, delicious fruit, juicy. Where I grew up, it grew wild in all the fence rows, and they're really great plums to eat. Lots of wonderful flavor. There's red raspberries are native, wild blueberries, and even hops are native. A lot of people don't realize it. And if you're not making beer, you can still use hops for tea. Apparently you can even make soap out of them. They're great to add into salads and so on. And so all of these things are native and you can use them for the kitchen. But what if you want to feed the caterpillars instead? What do you grow? Well, here we have a monarch caterpillar on milkweed. We've got an American lady caterpillar on pearly everlasting, and a giant swallowtail caterpillar on a hop tree. And many caterpillars only use one or two species of plant to live on. These are all examples of that. We do have a number of generalists that'll eat just about anything, but only one or two genus or species. So in this case, most milkweeds and very closely related plants are okay for monarchs. You've got pearly everlasting and pussy toes and one or two others that the American ladies will feed on. And for giant swallowtail caterpillars, it's hop trees and on prickly ash are the main sources of their food. So if you grow those, you will have them. I was lucky enough to be gifted a hop tree in the spring last year, and it came with a caterpillar, which was so cool. And so then that thing grew, it wandered off, made its chrysalis, flew around for a while, and a month or so later, there was another caterpillar on the hop tree. Whether it was from the one that hatched there, I don't know, but it was so exciting to see. First time I'd had a hop tree, and I was actually able to get an egg laid on it and a caterpillar grow from it. So if you grow false nettles, you can hope to find some red admiral caterpillars, which will become this beautiful butterfly. Stinging nettles and all members of the nettle family are what it uses, but false nettle and Canada wood nettle are both native. The stinging nettle is not. And so if you can find them, then grow those. Pearly everlasting, I already mentioned, it is native, the host plant for the Native American beauty, but also American lady, but also for the painted lady butterfly. And I mentioned the hop tree. There's what the giant swallowtail caterpillar looks like. Golden Alexanders host the black swallowtail caterpillar. The first year I grew a golden Alexander plant, and I only had the one plant, and I had 7 caterpillars on it in the middle of the summer. I was so excited, and I watched them and actually photographed them as they started to wander off to find a place to become a butterfly. And so that was really cool. So I got real excited, and I went out and I bought 6 or 7 more plants. I planted them around my garden in different places, and I've not seen a caterpillar since, but I know they do attract them. They're also attracted to dill and parsley. So if you have a vegetable garden, you can attract them using those plants as well. And this little caterpillar is a monarch caterpillar that landed on the butterfly milkweed in my one garden. And the next day I went down to see how he was doing, and he was gone. And then I looked around and I found him actually making the J shape, hanging from a volunteer elderberry shrub that was growing nearby. And that wasn't long becoming a chrysalis. And then days and days and days of waiting impatiently with my camera. And finally it hatched out, and I watched it fly off and land on this green-headed coneflower stem, where I got a few pictures of it. So that was pretty exciting. If you have kids in your household, what an opportunity for them to learn and watch how nature works. But did you know that of the 127 species of butterflies that are found in Southern Ontario, only 17 don't overwinter here? The rest all overwinter in Ontario. So that includes things like the morning cloak butterfly that overwinters as an adult. There's 6 of them that do overwinter that way. 12 overwinter as eggs. This is the banded hairstreak egg. Now they lay it on the bark of a tree where it overwinters, but some butterflies lay it just on the ground in the debris. 30 overwinter as a chrysalis, either on dead stalks in your garden or in the ground, in the leaf litter underneath. So if you clean up your gardens in the fall and remove all those stalks and remove all the dead leaves off the lawn, there's a very good chance that all the hard work you've done all year long growing plants to feed these butterflies is all being tossed out with the litter. 60 of our caterpillars actually, or butterflies actually overwinter in the caterpillar form, either from a very small early instar stage right through to adult caterpillars. And these guys, almost every one of them requires the leaf litter to hide in, to keep warm, to keep the birds from finding them. And we have 2 of them that, depending on the time of year that they're born, they will overwinter as either a chrysalis or a caterpillar. So I got all these stats from the Royal Ontario Museum's Guide to Butterflies of Ontario. So leave the leaves. If it's at all possible in your yard, leave as many as you can. This is my yard. You're looking at the waterfall here in the fall. It is, I will admit, quite a bit of work because the leaves blow into the pond up here and into the waterfall, and I have to keep scooping them out because it'll overflow. What do I do with them? I throw them in the flower beds. And I actually rake up some of these leaves through my lawn, but I just rake them over a bit and move them onto the flower beds when I can, because I want to maintain all that mulch for one thing, and it's great fertilizer for your plants. And that's the way nature does it. So let's copy what she's been doing. Leaves like this are the winter home for most of our butterflies, but they're also the home for many of our moths and many of the more spectacular moths that we have. For instance, the Luna moth overwinters in a cocoon. The Prometheus moth, Polyphemus moth, got it. It actually wraps its cocoons in leaves to camouflage it. And so you won't even see it likely. This is the largest moth in Canada. It has a wingspan of a good 5 inches, and it's pretty spectacular. I always get excited when the hummingbird clearwing moth is in my garden. They're beautiful to watch as they hover around your flowers. They overwinter as an adult in your garden. And the virgin tiger moth overwinters as a caterpillar. And so many other moths do as well. But it's not just important for butterflies and moths, it's also important for many of our ground nesting bees. It adds a layer of insulation to protect them. It also hides them from birds like northern flickers, which eat ants and other things they dig out of the soil. And so many of our bees are ground nesting. This one happens to be an American sand wasp, which eats flies, which is a nice reason to have these guys around. They actually capture the fly and they take it back and feed it to their larvae. And then they seal the tunnel for the winter. And that's where they spend their winters. The eggs do, and then they pupate in the spring and come out to fly around and start things over again. So those leaves are so important. Let's get back to plants. I have a question here for you. How many milkweeds do we have in Ontario? that are native to Ontario? Throw a number in the chat. Let's see what we got. 8, 4, 1. What else got? 4. Lots of 4s. Lots of people think we have 4. Oh, 3, 5. Okay, 14. Somebody's ambitious. 36. Wow. I hope you mean 3 or 6. 6. Okay. Nobody's quite right. Here are 6 native milkweeds in Ontario. Green milkweed, purple, butterfly, swamp, whorled, and common milkweed. All beautiful garden additions. Common milkweed, probably the most fragrant of them all, in my opinion anyway. But they're all interesting. But here's another 5. So we've got tall green milkweed. We've got 4-leaf milkweed, which is the only one of the milkweeds I don't have. So if anybody knows where I can get seeds, send me a note because I'll be your best friend if I can get some of those. Poke milkweed is our shade-tolerant milkweed. It will do well in part shade to mostly shaded areas. And it likes it a little damper, but it will tolerate a fair bit of drought once it gets established. Sullivan's milkweed looks very much like common milkweed in many ways. And then we have red ring milkweed. And red ring milkweed to me has got a spectacular flower. Unfortunately, it is now extirpated in Ontario. It's no longer found growing in the wild. And so you have to get seeds from somebody if you want to grow any. And those seeds will probably not come from Ontario. I've been growing it for 4 years and mine have yet to form seeds. They flower every year, beautiful flowers, but they never set seed. I'm not sure why. Now that's 11 species. We actually have one more that is native to Ontario, and that's dwarf milkweed. But as you can see from this map, it's only actually native up here in the Rainy River District. As you can see from this, it goes from northern Alberta down through the southern prairie provinces and down into the states here, and just barely makes it into it. I have this in my garden because I have a specialty milkweed garden only, and I fell in love with this when I lived in Manitoba and brought it back. It only gets about knee high. It has pretty yellow flowers. It is already setting seed before any of the other milkweeds start to bloom. It is a really early bloomer, so gorgeous little plant. And yes, the monarchs do like it. I have to keep taking them off of it and moving them over to my swamp milkweed because it's the only one that can handle that kind of traffic yet. So if you want to find these maps, this is where you can find them. monarchwatch.org, read articles, Canweed 3. You don't need to write it down now because this information will be made available. You can watch it again later. But that's where I got these maps from. They're actually out of the Atlas of Rare Vascular Plants of Ontario by Pryor, Argus and Pryor and so on. Great maps for milkweeds. Other things you can grow in your garden, moss. Moss actually makes a really beautiful garden. When I started making this garden originally, people thought I was crazy. What do you want moss for? I'm trying to kill it off out of my lawn. And I just couldn't understand it because I find moss so delicate and beautiful. But it is definitely the highest maintenance garden you will grow. This was my moss garden. This was early spring, and this would fill out and be beautifully green. There would be liverworts growing in here. All of these ferns are volunteers. Mostly it's sensitive fern, but there's quite a few others that just, that's the problem with a moss garden, is it is such ideal conditions for everything to grow in that everything seeds into it. When I moved away for 4 years to Manitoba, then I came home and there was no sign of the moss. It was full of everything, and half of it was non-natives, things like, forget-me-nots and other things that I end up ripping out by the arms full. So this garden now is something entirely different. In fact, If anybody has been to my garden, might recognize this rock. It sits right beside the huge Canada lily, which sits there. Excuse me. Fern gardens are really beautiful things to grow. If you've got moisture, if you've got shade, but ferns will grow in full sun, ferns will grow in dry, ferns will grow on rock faces. Our ferns are very versatile. You just need to find the ones that'll match the condition of your garden. They make great gardens all by themselves. I've got at least 19 species of ferns now growing, and most of them grow back where this lady fern is growing at the back. I have a huge ostrich fern garden as well, but I also have ferns just tucked in here and there with other species. They make great filler. Who needs hostas? Oops. We have grasses, beautiful grasses, as nice as any of that non-native stuff you find at the nurseries. Big blue stem. It'll get to be 6, 7, 8 feet high if the conditions are right. In my garden, it's growing in way too much shade. It only gets about 4 feet, 5 feet at tops. Little blue stem, I love. And in the fall, when it's in seed like this, and the light shines through, and it's beautiful. Indian grass is another majestic grass that you can grow in your gardens. Prairie dropseed. If anybody watched the Addams Family when they were kids or has seen the movies, and Cousin It, that's just what prairie dropseed reminds me of, especially this time of year when it's all dead and that brown grass is just draped down over the sides. A very well-behaved clumping grass. I've never had it spread, so it is just a beautiful addition to the garden. Bottle brush grass, you can grow that the same place you grow your milkweed, in the shade. It grows along forest edges and in light shade in the gardens, in your garden. Purple love grass was new to me this year. I just planted my first ones this spring, and they get this delicate purple haze to them when they're in seed in the fall. A wonderful addition. Now, if we were face to face, which is what I'm used to talking, I'd be asking questions at this point, but I'm running short on time, so I'm going to speed it up a bit. Where do I start? Well, you start small. If you haven't already planted some, just stick a few natives here and there with your other plants, or create a new little flower bed out of the way. But if you've got a large blank canvas, well, go for it. Map it all out and start making beds and putting them in, depending what your features are. This was my map of my yard that I made a number of years ago, actually, before it looked like it does now. It'll take a lot of research to know what to plant where, so start small. That's my opinion. Where can you find more about native plants? Facebook. It has its negative points, and for the most part, I hate Facebook, but when it comes to finding out more about native plant gardening, there are fabulous communities there. Ontario Native Plant Gardening is one of the most popular here in Ontario. Sean Booth started this about in 2018, and there's already over 21,000 members in that group. Mike Smith started Relief Chatham Kent here, which is for all us local guys and gals to tune into. Mike's always got something on the go with native plants. He kind of specializes in trees, but he organizes the garden tours that happen here in Chatham Kent in the summer. North American Native Plant Society, which is actually a Canadian organization, and the Ontario Native Plant and Seed Exchange, all great things. The Windsor Essex, the Kingsville, the Huron County Native Plant Gardening Facebook groups, all excellent sources of information. And for those that are south of the border, there's native plants of the Northeast, native plant gardens in the upper Midwest, native trees, shrubs, and vines of Ohio, the Indiana Native Plant Society, and the Pennsylvania Native Plant Gardening, and lots more. So it is one of the fastest growing sectors of horticulture, and the groups that are on Facebook that are there for support, for advice, it's just a fabulous resource. And then, of course, I'll put a shameless plug in for my own Facebook page, The Native Plant Gardener. and I like to post anything to do with native plants up on that as I come across an interesting article. Mostly I use it to put pictures that I've taken in my garden though. And I always try to educate when I do that. Excellent books if you want to know the why. If you haven't read either one of these, get yourself a copy, buy it, get it from the library. Bringing Nature Home was his earlier book, and then Doug Tallamy came out with Nature's Best Hope. And these tell us why we need to plant more native species. But if you want to know what to plant, Lorraine Johnson has some excellent books. These two, Grow Wild and 100 Easy to Grow Native Plants, were among the very first books I ever bought on native plant gardening. Excellent starting spot, but she and Sheila Kalla have come out with the Garden for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee this year, and this book is just excellent. I watched a webinar the other day with Doug Tallamy, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, if you buy only one book, buy this one. It was a heck of a pitch for it, and I think it's an awesome book, beautiful pictures, and Sanderson's diagrams are so lifelike, and the rest of the plants she has great photos of. Another great book is this one, Propagating Wildflowers by William Cullenna from the New England Wildflower Society. Great pictures, lots of great plant descriptions, both for propagating, but also how to grow them. And Native Plants of the Northeast, one of my earliest acquisitions by Donald Leopold, same thing. Beautiful pictures, well laid out, covers everything, not just flowers, both it covers shrubs, trees, and vines and so on as well. So where do you get plants? After watching this, you need to buy more plants, right? I always do. So what I did to help us out was I created this map. You can go to my website and get a live link to it. I live down here. As you can see, there's not much real close, but there are some good ones not too far away where you can get native plants. I have been to most of these. I've bought plants from most of those over the last few years. If you're south of the border and you don't want to illegally take plants back across with you, then my map actually covers all of North America. I spent a lot of fun days just surfing the web and finding where every native plant nursery or garden center that sells native plants and advertises them was located, and it's on the map. So you can go into nativeplantgardener.ca, which is my shameless plug for my website, and click on the map and go in, zoom into where you live, click on a dot, and it'll bring up the information about that particular garden center or nursery. Here in Southwestern Ontario, some of my go-to places, Anjanong Greenhouse in Sarnia. I've bought a lot of plants there over the years. It can be hit and miss the quality of the plants, but they definitely have a good variety of unusual ones. But my new favorite, I think, is Golden Alexanders in Sarnia. Nick has really got a green thumb and produces a lot of beautiful plants there. Liz in Heavenly Earth in Thamesville, she started out mostly trees and shrubs, but she's been expanding and getting more into the perennials as well. Another great place is Origin Native Plants in Guelph, if you happen to be from up that way. Those guys have wonderful plants. They took over the inventory from Grand Moraine Growers when he closed, and they got a lot of really interesting species and good quality plants. They've recently started mail order, but it's been kind of hit and miss till I get the bugs ironed out of that. Sean Booth in Our Nature in Orangeville, lots of lovely plants from him. And you may have heard me say the name already. He's the one who started the Ontario Native Plant Gardening Facebook group. Not So Hollow Farm up in Creemore. If you're from up that way, I have family up there, so I've dropped in there and bought plants a number of times. And Native Trees and Plants in Amherstburg, I have not been that far southwest yet to buy plants. It's on my to-do list, but I've heard good things about them. And then we have Ontario Native Plants, which is onplants.ca. It's online only. They don't have a nursery you can go to visit, and they ship to you. But they do have the shipping down pat. I've hardly ever heard a complaint at all about the quality of the plants that get shipped. And then my own webpage, nativeplantgardener.ca. So you can go in there. What I try to do on this webpage is at the first of the month, I write an article about something to do with native plants. Just something that somebody's asked me to discuss or something I found curious, and I'll write an article. Mid-month, then I put up a plant of the month. And this is gives you lots of pictures of the plant, tells you how to grow it, what it's going to look like, what insects it'll feed, how to propagate the plants, tells you whether it's a species at risk or not, and lots of other information. And so I do a different plant each month, about mid-month. And when I get a chance in the first quarter, I like to put up a book review. I've only done about 3 so far. It's tough getting a chance to read those when I'm reading so many other things as well. And lately I've started to create a crossword puzzle about native plants that goes up in week 3 of each month. And yes, I have a few made up ahead now. So for the next few months, if you guys had fun doing those that were following it, there's going to be more coming along. I will warn you though, they're going to get tougher as the months progress. So just keep that in mind. And so if I have time, I've got about a 4-minute set of images to go through on my garden. So Alyssa, should I hit the play button?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, super. So this is my garden I call the corral garden. Once I click to the next slide, it'll go automatically. And so I've got a few images of overall gardens, and then I have a bunch of images of individual plants throughout the garden. So I call it the corral because it has the rail fence along it. So here we go. This is the view of that yard from the falls. This was that first garden I put in, and this is it as well, a different year. It changes. Monardas. Indian paintbrush is a hemiparasite. It needs a grass to grow with. Some Michigan lily. The rabbits ate all my Michigan lily off last year. I hope they'll come back. Here's my wild columbine. And this was a massive Jack in the Pulpit. I have not planted a Jack in the Pulpit here, and yet I have dozens and dozens growing. The squirrels plant them, or the ants, I guess, actually spread it. This is my beautiful black cherry tree. And my flowering dogwood blooms like this every second year. This year was a bad year, so next spring should be a good one. Water avens, which is also known as chocolate root. Once it gets big enough, I'm going to taste it and find out. And this is growing in my bog garden, showy lady slipper, as is the southern blue flag iris. And I mentioned that we have ferns that grow in rocks. This is 10 years old, this fern, and it's still growing in that rock. The male flower of tall meadow rue, and the delicate white flowers of virgin's bower and their spectacular seed head afterwards. I've recently started growing more sedges. I've got half a dozen different species now. This is Pennsylvania sedge, and Calthopalustris, which is marsh marigold, is interesting both in flower and in seed. Another gorgeous little fern, maidenhair fern. And I love the seeds on wild geranium, and those things explode and send the seeds flying. This is green dragon. As you may be able to tell, it's related to Jack in the Pulpit. It's a fairly rare plant in Ontario. And this is Canada wild onion, sometimes called wild garlic. And this one surprised me. New this year to me was broadleaf waterleaf. That flower is actually hidden under the leaf. You have to go looking for it. And this is my big Canada lily. This year there were 2 stalks and there were 54 blooms between the 2 stalks. And this is the dotted horse mint that the black digger wasp likes. And my pearly everlasting. And there we have a summer azure butterfly. Very hard to get them with their wings open. And the clouded sulfur on some New England aster. And of course, the eastern tiger swallowtail on my cup plants. And we've got some brilliant colors. Cardinal flowers are just breathtaking. New to me this year also was wing stem. I planted some for the first time. And one of my favorites, pale corydalis, technically not native where I live, but it is such a tough little plant and I love its delicate flowers and leaves. Sneezeweed, sometimes called Helen's flower. And the very obedient plant, it doesn't listen to you at all. And blue lobelia, and new to me again this year, the fringe gentian, which were just spectacular. I had 3 plants, I had almost 30 flowers on them. And that's that. So that's it for my presentation.
All right, that was excellent. Can everybody hear me? Hopefully, yes. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Rick. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everybody when I say I know I certainly learned a lot. That was wonderful. So now we'll go into a little bit of a Q&A session right now. And just if everybody will just bear with me here for a couple of minutes, I'll make sure I get everybody's questions answered. I know there's a couple questions in the chat. There's a couple questions in the Q&A. So I'll be sure to make sure that I get everybody. So we'll just go one at a time, okay? So first, we've got a question from Brandy. She said she would love to hear more ideas on native plants that would work well in pots, ones that don't need a ton of space for their root system.
Actually, there are lots of great potted plants. I was actually surprised when I grew that green-headed coneflower that it did so well, because that plant in my garden will get 7 or 8 feet tall. And in fact, not this past summer, but the summer before, it was over 9 feet tall. And so I didn't expect it to do well at all. But I had a large pot. So if you've got a big enough pot to put it in, then you can grow a lot of things. I've grown ostrich ferns in there. There are actually on the Native Plant Gardening Facebook group, I believe in the files, there's a section in there that talks about plants that are good for pots. I'm actually working on a list of those, and I know quite a few now that because I've been asking people what have they grown. Our Monardas, the bee balm, wild bergamot, and so on, they're very shallow rooted. They grow well in pots. I've grown clammy ground cherry in a pot, and it did wonderful all summer, but it didn't survive the winter. So that's one I'm going to work on to see what I have to do to make it survive the winter in the pot. Most of my plants will survive when they're young in pots, because I pot a lot of them up in the fall and I just sit them in a pile of leaves to overwinter, and they do fine. But if you've got big pots on the deck, most of our plants will grow there well. We have a few that have tap roots, but not that many. So even though they do have long roots, and that's one of the reasons we like to grow native species, they will grow in a more confined space anyway. So not usually an issue. Many plants will do well in pots. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. Fiona is asking, what source do you use for these maps, please? I believe that question came in while you were showing the maps with the shaded areas with the purple milkweed. Does that ring a bell?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I've made all those maps myself. That took 3 years of research.
Oh, wow.
I've got about 200 species mapped. I worked closely with Will Van Hemison, who's an ecologist and consultant here in Ontario, but also with the heads of the Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, either Department of Forestry or Natural Resources or Natural Heritage offices or whatever, to confirm my maps. And it was a lot of work creating them. I'll throw a plug out here, but it's a long time coming, possibly. But Sean Booth and I have actually been working on a book on native plant gardening that includes maps for all of the species. The book is ready to go, so if anybody has a publisher in their back pocket that they'd like to talk to me about, let me know. We've been struggling to find a publisher. Most people, they're just not accepting books these days unless it's fiction for the most part. That's what we've been finding. But anyway, other than that, yeah, those maps are ones that I generated myself. My background is actually in GIS, computer mapping. And so I researched the historical literature, the current literature, and as many things as I could find, talked to many people as I could, and generated all those maps.
Okay, so the next question, Rick, would you have any seeds or plants to share in the future for plants that you grow?
I actually normally don't, and simply because what I do is I have garden tours here, which takes a lot of my time to do. And so I actually sell the plants, kind of make up for my time that I spend keeping my gardens in show shape and touring people around, because it's quite a few hours out of a day every time. So I'm selfish that way. I want to sell them instead of give them away. If you've somehow managed to work your way into one of my close circle of friends, that's a different story. But no, I normally haven't sent them out. Having said that, though, I am always interested in trading. If you've got something of interest that is not on my list, but with over 300 species now on my list, that's getting harder and harder to come across. But I will trade. I'm good for barter.
Okay, I've got here, I'm growing Canadian, oh, shoot, hang on. I'm growing Canadian red bud seed this year. Any tips would be appreciated, including how long it'll actually take for how it'll take to actually look like a tree. Sorry, guys.
Ah, interesting. That picture you saw of my redbud tree in there, that tree was planted in 2000 and I want to say 2010. And when I planted it, it was almost waist high, but the top third of it didn't look great. And the person I bought it from said, no problem, it's fall, it's losing its leaves the way it should be. But I didn't really believe them. And in the spring, only the bottom 2/3 came up. The top part never leafed out. So it grew. And then the next winter, the rabbit ate it off. And so it was only about 6 inches high. So for the first 3 years, the plant got shorter and shorter. And so that tree you saw is what's there now. And it didn't take long once it got established. One thing you'll hear about native plants, and trees are no different, is they usually take a while to get the root system established. The whole thing of first year sleep, second year creep, third year leap holds true with trees as well, as from what my experience has been. So depending on how much soil moisture you have in your soil, what other growing conditions are for that particular species, you may or may not have something huge in a short period of time.
All right. Do you grow your blue flags in full sun and wet?
It is wet, but it is not full sun. It's probably morning sun only. Having said that, those, because it has so many flowers on them, there are so many seeds in it that those plants actually have been volunteering in other places in my yard where it isn't wet. How long they'll last there, I don't know. We had a drought this summer, and yet it didn't kill them off, the ones that are growing outside of the wet area. So we'll see. At least most of them didn't die off. but they do actually prefer wet, at least moist. Although I have seen them growing on the gravel shoulder of a road after a beaver dam was broken and the road had been wet previously, but they survived for a few years in the dry shoulder of the road.
Okay, and then I've got a question from Isabel. What camera do you use?
Most of my pictures are taken with my cell phone, and what I take, some of the really good clear close-up shots come from, I've got a Canon T4i. It's an older model camera. I use a 100, is it 100? No, 55 to 250 zoom telephoto lens on it. And that's kind of my cheating macro, because I can stand back and not disturb the insects that I'm photographing and zoom right in on them and get a nice clear shot. Camera is, the lens is good quality, and so the pictures are clear.
All right, we do have quite a few questions, which we will get to all of them. I am just going to cut in here for a quick second. I see some people are leaving the webinar, which is completely fine. Just for a Q&A, if you don't feel like sticking around, please don't feel the need to. But we are getting some great answers here. So if you do want to stick around, that's also perfectly fine. But before you leave, I do just want to remind everyone to take a look at both our Eventbrite page and social media for our upcoming events. If you missed them at the beginning, again, that was just our Imagine McGregor Through the Eyes of Youth art show. That will be an environmentally themed art show next Friday at William Street Cafe. It's free entry and should be a really great event to see what the youth of Chatham-Kent can come up with, as well as our second webinar in the series, Healing Alongside Nature with Carol Kazile about eco-psychology. And again, those are both on our Eventbrite page and our social media as well. All right, back to you, Sarah.
All right, we'll keep this moving along. So it says, Rick, can you explain to people how you've contained your milkweeds in your milkweed garden?
Most of them I didn't. Common milkweed is the only one that's really an aggressive spreader and problematic. And so I did similar with it as I did with my Jerusalem artichoke. I put a large pot and I sunk it into the ground, and that's where I planted the milkweed. The first one was in a big pot. The second one I put in was just in a white 5-gallon pail that I cut the bottom out of and dug a hole, set it in, and filled the dirt back in, and that's where I planted it so they don't spread. The only other one that's aggressive so far, at least in my garden, and it's only 3 years old, that milkweed garden, is the whorled milkweed, and it's only about knee high. Beautiful, delicate little plant with lovely greeny white flowers on it. And it spreads fairly aggressively too, but it is very easy to just pull them out when you're pulling out the non-native weeds that pop in every once in a while too. The root is not deep. It's not really tough to break it off. If they find down the road that they become problematic, I'll just dig them out and bury a tub there.
Okay, so we've got Denise is asking, is the spotted bee balm the same plant as the dotted horse mint?
It is.
Okay.
Monarda punctata, which is why I really prefer the Latin names for plants, because something like Caltha palustris, which is your marsh marigold, I found at least 30 distinct common names for that plant online. And so it depends on where you grow up, what you're going to call it. Did you know that wild columbine is called cluckies in some regions? I mean, just weird names to me, but they're all called Aquilegia canadensis. We know what that plant is.
All right, so Kathy is asking, she says, you leave the leaves. Do you add extra mulch?
No. When I create a new flower bed, as you saw in there, because they're new and because the soil has recently been disturbed, and because I have to do something to keep the cats from using it for a litter box, what I do is I buy chopped straw. It comes in a compressed bale, and I spread that around on the surface as a mulch. it makes it look nicer. The mulch will eventually decay, and that is the only mulch that I put on. In a woodland garden, I will top up with wood chips. So under my maple trees, I'll use wood chips there. And at the very back, where it's moister under the walnut trees, I'll also use wood chips in there occasionally. My theory is that in gardens that are mostly prairie species, so your cup plants and your monardas and your those kinds of things, they never evolved with the biological environment of forests. And so I don't put wood chips on those beds at all. To me, it doesn't make sense. That's why I use the chopped straw. It's a grass. It's what these things are used to. So microorganisms that will be decomposing that straw are the same ones these plants evolved with. Under the maple trees, on the other hand, grasses don't necessarily grow there, but there's lots of decaying wood in a forest. And so the species that I'm trying to grow under there, the trilliums and the Dutchman's breeches and the wild leeks and all those plants, wild geranium, they all grew in soil that is basically made from leaves and branches. And so now they've got their organisms, their families all happy there. The leaves get spread around. They decay very fast. By June, the leaves are pretty much all gone in all my flower beds, even the ones where I have it piled a foot deep along the one fence. It doesn't take long for them to decompose. But no, I don't add other mulches.
Okay, so we've got Martha from Kent Bridge asking, do you plant your plant gardens by variety, color, height, or all?
Yes, all. No, what I do is I look at my gardens. I'm so fortunate with this property. When I bought it, it was a blank slate, but I could see the potential here. And I've got high, dry land in full shade, in full sun. Move to the back of the property, it goes down the slope. I've got part shade, I've got full sun in medium moisture soil. I've got damper soil at the very back under the walnut trees and mostly full shade. And so I match the plants to the garden first. So I've got a full garden. What's an interesting plant that I can put in here? Full sun garden in full and dry, full sun. All right. I know that things like Monarda punctata, the dotted horsemint, the pearly everlasting, sundrops, hoary vervain, a lot of these plants, those are the conditions they like. So I will find a spot to put them in there. And I'm an impatient gardener. I often tend to just keep putting things in and then finding out, oh, this guy's a little aggressive. I've got to do something different here. But for me, that's the fun of it, just seeing what'll happen when I put these things together. I try to keep them happy in the conditions of soil moisture and light that they want. And other than that, I let them go. So my garden at the back that I call the Land of the Giants, it started out with a lot of plants of different sizes. Tall ones in the back corner that kind of moved their way forward. They were a little more aggressive than I thought they would be. So things like the cup plant and the green-headed coneflower, the false sunflower, the white flat-topped aster, these things are huge plants. So the littler ones kind of got crowded out. So those get moved out then later and put in a new garden somewhere else. So for instance, this spring, I moved out of that tall garden at the back. I moved out my white heath aster, my calico aster, and a few other things, and I stuck them somewhere else where they wouldn't have to compete with the tall plants so much. So as far as color goes, I don't worry too much about what color something is. I worry more about what's going to use it and is it going to be happy in those conditions.
Okay, great. So this looks like more of a, okay, so we've got, it's from LP. So suggestions for plants to replace lily of the valley and periwinkle. So aggressive ground covers for shade to suggest to folks who want something easy.
Okay, under my maples, before I found out about natives, I planted periwinkle. And it took me 3 years to get rid of that stuff. But I now have some lovely plants growing in there. Easy plants are, but you do have to get them established. Things like wild ginger will grow in shade where periwinkle grows. Virginia waterleaf is a great one. It'll grow in dry shade as well. I have that broadleaf waterleaf that I had the beautiful white flower on, but it needs a lot more moisture. So if you got moist shade, it'll do okay there. If you're looking for something that is showy, our wood poppy, beautiful yellow flowers. Make sure you don't get the non-native one. Make sure the celandine poppy looks very similar, but is non-native and is a nasty plant. But there's lots of things, and grow ferns. Where you pull out those shade-loving things like the ditch lilies and so on, although ditch lilies usually do better in full sun, but then the sky's, the limit for what you can plant where you pull the ditch lilies out. But things that'll grow where the periwinkle grows is a tougher one. And so, you've got ostrich ferns, you've got a number of different ferns that'll grow in dry shade, and just start exploring with those. Easy to grow, looks very nice.
Okay, so Kathy says, I decided to leave the leaves this fall and then was worried that they would blow away. So I put a thin layer of topsoil on top. Will I be suffocating the natives that I just planted last year? So worried that the layer will be so thick that nothing will pop through the spring.
It depends on how thick the layer is. When I started doing it, I took all of my leaves and I raked them onto my understory, my shade garden, and I probably had a layer this thick. And by the spring, it was down about this thick, and it was frozen. We had a very wet, cold winter, and it was a dense mass. And so by sometime in early May, I thought my plants are never going to come through. So I started lifting this off gently. And what I discovered was that, yes, the plants are there and they were working their way up through it anyway. And I ended up destroying so many plants that got ripped off just because they were trapped into that mat of leaves. If it's only a couple of inches thick, then the leaves will have no effect. Our natives are used to that.
Okay, so Suzanne Kelly says, what natives attract lightning bugs?
What you want for lightning bugs is vegetation for them to hide in through the day. I have some eastern white cedar growing at the back corner of my property, and that's where all the ferns are and so on. And that's where they seem to hang out for the most part. They want just dense vegetation to protect themselves from predators through the day, and then they'll come out at night. That's where I see them first, and then they spread out over the yard for the evening.
Okay, so Martha Gillier says, do you hand collect your seeds and grow in pots or let self-seed?
I have no patience for growing plants from seed, so I just let them grow where they want. When I have a plant that I want to move the seeds from it, I cut the seed head off and I just sprinkle it around in the garden, let Mother Nature do it. I don't have a good place in my house to start them. I haven't tried winter sowing yet, although it's probably going to happen sooner rather than later. But I've got enough now that I don't really worry about that.
Okay. With your yard becoming increasingly shaded from the trees, have you had to change the types of plants you grow? I understand that most natives need a lot of sun.
Not true. Most natives do not need a lot of sun. And in fact, we have prairie species that evolved with full sun. Yes, those need it. So something like gray goldenrod or Verbena hestat, or Verbena stricta rather, hoary vervain, cut plants and so on, they will not do very well if they're shaded. But what has surprised me is how many of my plants actually do very well in part shade at least, and even in full shade. I've got Monarda didyma, which is the scarlet bee balm. You saw some pictures of it in the full sun garden, but it does just as well in part shade. And in fact, in the almost full shade garden, it blooms later in the season than it does in the full sun. So it actually extends my bee balm bloom through the year, and it is doing just fine in almost full shade. So a number of our plants will tolerate it. Keep in mind that this part of Southern Ontario had areas that were prairie, but it also had large areas that were forested, and it had areas of in between. One of the things that First Nations peoples did when they were here was they altered the landscape by burning. We actually did have buffalo at one point that would come up through here and graze and remove a lot of the trees. And so we had areas of savanna, which were part trees, part just grasses and forbs. And so those areas, any plant that grew there will grow in part shade or full sun. Either way, they're not that fussy. It's only a minority of them that require full sun to survive.
Okay, and Jan is saying, do you come to speak to hort societies that will host you from out of town to speak on native plants? LaSalle, possibly? If yes, discuss fees. Thank you.
I won't discuss fees here.
That's what I figured.
You can reach out to me through Alyssa or Sarah, and we can discuss it. But yes, I do. I talk to hort societies.
Great.
And I've got the chat box up here, and I saw whether she's still on or now. Fiona said, rabbits ate my red buds, grr. I know your pain, but your red bud probably will come back if it's been established for one season. Probably definitely come back if it was more than just 1 year old.
Okay, Jan is also asking, can you speak of Shasta daisies? Are they native?
No.
Lots of insects and butterflies love them.
No, they're not native. I'd have to pull up the web to see where they're native to, but I'm pretty sure they're one of the ones that was brought over. And just now that I've said that, I better not be lying here, so I will just do a quick check. So that's the lovely thing about Mr. Google. He knows everything. Shasta daisy native range. It's a hybrid, commonly called Shasta daisy, is a hybrid developed by so-and-so in the 1890s near snow-covered Mount Shasta in Northern California. So there you go. We just learned something.
Awesome. So Brandy is asking, other than lupines and columbines, are there other common garden non-natives that will hybridize with native varieties and interfere with the native properties of the plants?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, we look at in trees, the mulberry, red mulberry, which is a very rare native here in Ontario, readily hybridizes with the white mulberry, which was brought over in the 1600s, I believe, to grow silkworm moths on. So they will hybridize, and in fact, there's suggestions that we have very few pure red mulberries left in Ontario. But for the other plants, there's not enough of them that are similar that it is a problem for. Now, having said that, there may be some that will hybridize with some of the asters, but I'm not sure.
Okay, then we've got somebody asking, do you have a suggestion of a bush that will grow on a slope under a mature black walnut and American basswood tree? From Lori in the Carolinian zone.
And it depends a lot on your soils and so on. It depends on how big a bush you want, and it depends on how much moisture is there. So shrubs can be fairly fussy in wanting to meet their needs. I have a beautiful little shrub that is called leatherwood, and it will get about 5 to 7 feet tall and the same spread across. It lives in full shade under my walnut trees, but it requires a fair bit of moisture. In fact, enough moisture that I actually have to turn the sprinkler hose on it whenever the weather gets dry or it starts to lose leaves. So that's one that'll live under black walnuts. My eastern white cedar, they get fairly tall, but you can prune them back. It's doing well. Then you've got a whole lot of things that grow in the forest naturally. So things in our forests around here. So things like maple leaf viburnum, it'll do okay. Blue beech doesn't get to be a big tree. It is, sometimes called musclewood. It grows under those conditions. I've got both of those, in fact, growing under the walnuts at the back of my place. They do like a little bit more moisture. The blue beech might be a bit more tolerant of dry shade. Spice bush, beautiful bush, will grow in the shade of black walnuts. I've got one, and it's in part sun, part shade, but it's probably 15 feet tall and 20 feet across, even though the books don't say they get that big. So yeah, there's lots of choices when you start to look at it. There's sumac. People curse it sometimes because it's very aggressive, but if this is a slope you're trying to stabilize, sumac is a great tree for that. It will, the roots will spread across and tie the soil in from eroding.
So Bridget is asking if you have any tips for getting rid of periwinkle.
Yeah, mussels. Unfortunately, that's about the only thing you can do is just keep working at it, digging it up. I dug mine up in the fall the first time, ripped it all out, and then I went through in the spring and found all the little green sprouts that I could find coming up. But you invariably miss a few pieces, and you have to go back again the next year and do it again. And it took me 3 years of doing that before I finally didn't find any more coming up in my garden. But really, it's just grunt labor. You got to get in there and rip them out. Sorry.
All right. And Fiona had asked earlier when you were asking the question about Phragmites, she said, is there a native Phragmites?
Yes. We do have native ones here. I'm not familiar with them myself, although I do know they exist. They're not as tall. One of the things that the invasive one, my understanding is that when the seed heads in the fall, they are ripe, they go dark, very almost black, and our native ones are very pale and light. And that's one way of differentiating them. But I'm definitely not an expert on those. So a little bit of homework needed.
All right. And Helen from near Kitchener is asking, with climate change, can we anticipate the Carolinian species will likely survive in areas north of its current previous range?
Some of them will, yes. Keep in mind that it's not just climate that determines where a plant lives. So when you saw those two range maps, the climates on one side of that boundary versus the other is not very far away, will be almost identical. And yet that obviously is part of why they grow there, but not the determining factor. So soils, the underlying geology will have a huge impact on what plants survive as climate change happens. There is this whole idea of assisted migration, which is moving mainly trees is where it started, helping them to move north because their seeds may not spread as fast as what climate change will dictate. And so they'll be able to move into new areas, but then they'll also be not doing so well in the more southerly areas where it's becoming too hot and dry or extreme. As far as the flowers go, there's probably not as big a concern about those seeds moving. Many of our seeds are wind dispersed or bird dispersed. And so those plants are not going to have a huge problem moving with the climate and the speed our climate is moving. Bigger concerns would be for trees, but also whether these plants will survive the physical conditions of where they need to go to keep up with the climate. That's going to be something we'll have to see.
Okay, so Helen is asking, how long do Jerusalem artichoke tubers keep in the fridge?
That's interesting. This year, my harvest lasted a week and a half, 2 weeks maybe, which is what I read. But I've still got tubers in there from the previous year that are just fine. So I think it must have a lot to do with the conditions when they're harvested and so on. And I don't know what I did different between the two to be able to tell you why previous year's tubers lasted right through. And in fact, they were sprouting this spring and I planted a bunch of them and they grew beautifully. And yet they were still firm in the fridge. And yet this year's harvest didn't last. It didn't last 3 weeks. I know that for sure. It was barely 2 weeks and they were already going soft in the fridge. And they're both in the same crisper drawer in my fridge side by side. So who knows?
All right, so I'm just going through and just looking at the rest of the comments here. I'll look through the few final questions, but what I can look at right now is just everybody saying how amazing it was and they're thanking you. So lots of great feedback here.
Great.
And I do have somebody asking, do you have tips on growing Michigan lily from seed? I'd like to try this year and heard that it's tricky.
It is tricky. And the thing about Michigan lily and Canada lily seeds is they take at least 2 years before they're going to sprout. So when you plant them after the first year, it sends down a little bit of a root into the soil and then it just sits there and does nothing for a year. And it isn't until it gets a second winter that it decides to send a sprout up. And then it can be several years after that before you actually get a plant that will flower. I've taken corms off of Michigan lily and moved them over. And even though they were already part of the root system, and they took years before they actually came up above the ground and started to look like a Michigan lily plant. So yeah, tricky to grow, very, very slow. You need a lot more patience than I have.
Okay, so I've got another question here. Did you have to amend your soil to grow fringed gentian? Do you have the conditions for it? Hopefully I didn't pronounce that too horribly.
That's gentian, so you're close enough. Yeah, I am just blessed with the soils I have here. I have the ideal conditions for it. It's moist, it's rich, loamy, well-drained soil, and it just seems to love it there. I do not amend my soils other than the mulch that I put on New Gardens, which is just straw. The very first native plant garden I created, I thought I took my old gardening practices, add manure. So I got a truckload of rotted cattle manure and I spread it over the garden. And for the next 5 years, the native plants in there grew tall, lanky, fell over. It took them many years to use up all those excess nutrients. Our native plants don't need that stuff. And so I do not amend my soils. If you grow plants that match your soil conditions, they'll do fine with what you've got. You don't have to worry about adding anything to it. What I've discovered, I grew a number of plants that required very acidic soil, and I tried to acidify it for about 3 years and finally gave up, because when you're thinking about the depth of the soil, you have to put so much extra stuff on it to change the characteristics of that soil that you're really fighting a losing battle. If you're trying to grow something there that isn't meant to grow in those conditions, you'll spend a fortune on additives to make the soil match your plants. Go the other way. It's always easier. And as far as the gentians go, yeah, it just, as long as you've got moisture and you've got fairly rich, loamy soil, they'll do fine. And full sun, afternoon shade is okay. That's what mine have, and they seem to be happy where they are.
Okay, great. So this Vicky is asking, how are you preparing your gardens for initial planting?
That newest garden I created, and this is how I've done most of my gardens, is I just take a shovel and I scrape the sod off, make a pile of it somewhere so the grass decomposes, and then it gets thrown back into a garden somewhere later. And normally I just dig it with a shovel, turn it over, loosen it up. A lot of the soil in my backyard has been compacted for various reasons. Building that escarpment did a lot of soil compaction. And then when I built my garden shed, they had machinery coming in to bring the concrete in. So a lot of reasons the soil is compacted. So I loosen it up to at least give them a fighting chance, make it seem a little more like it was when, before we came and destroyed the soil structure. But yeah, that's all I do. And then I stick my plants in, and the first year, if it's out in the sun, I put a bit of straw mulch down. That's it.
Okay, great. I do believe, unless I've missed anybody, I've gone through all the questions and I've gone through the chat. It looks as though that's the final question.
Awesome.
So unless any more squeak in the next couple of minutes, I guess we'll just say another thank you, thank you, thank you. This was such a great webinar, and I think everybody will agree. We'll be sending a conservation area pass your way, a season's pass as a thank you. We do really appreciate this. And again, for those of you that might not have caught the whole presentation or have a neighbor that would have loved to have seen this, it was recorded and it will be on YouTube. You'll just have to bear with us. Sometimes these technical things take us a little bit to get it figured out, but it will be there in the coming days. So don't worry if you missed it.
I'm glad people enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed talking about native plants all the time.
We like hearing about it. So Alyssa, unless there's anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's good for me. Thank you again, Rick. As you can see from the chat, everybody very much enjoyed your presentation, and we did as well. So thank you very much for that.
Good.
All right, have a good night, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you in the rest of our webinars to come.
Thanks so much, guys.
Take care.